It began with a sound, thin, metallic, almost fragile, carried on the monsoon winds over the jungled edges of the Solomon Islands on a gray morning in January 1943. A lone twin-engine aircraft, its engines coughing like a wounded animal, emerged through a veil of drifting rain. The sunlight broke in shards across its pale green fuselage, revealing a shape American pilots had come to fear. The Mitsubishi G4M, the Japanese Navy's long-range bomber the Allies had nicknamed the Betty. Moments later, the plane convulsed, clipped the canopy of a palm ridge, and skidded across a clearing with a scream of twisting metal. When the smoke settled, the wreck lay still, its profile ghostly, almost delicate. It looked less like a weapon of war and more like a relic made of glass and bones. Within hours, U.S. Marines had ringed the crash site. Within days, the Army Air Forces dispatched a small cadre of pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers to examine the remains. They expected to find some hidden strength in the enemy's most persistent bomber, some armored trick or secret innovation that explained how the Japanese had projected power across half the Pacific. Instead, they found something that defied their understanding. Fuel tanks exposed like ribs beneath torn skin, unprotected, unarmored, and astonishingly vulnerable. Here lay the contradiction that would shape the heart of this story. The Allies assumed the Japanese bomber was formidable because it was strong. In truth, it was formidable because it was fragile. This was the paradox of the Pacific Air War. Two nations, two ideologies, two visions of technology hurtling toward each other on opposite vectors. The United States built its aircraft as fortresses, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, redundancy in every system. Survival was an engineering principle. Resilience was doctrine. Japan, by contrast, forged its aerial philosophy around an almost spiritual pursuit of advantage. Speed, range, and striking distance above all else. Protection was weight, and weight was the enemy. The G4M embodied this creed completely. To reach far across the ocean, to carry torpedoes deep into enemy territory, the aircraft sacrificed armor, pilot protection, and even the basic safeguarding of its own fuel. It was a bomber designed not to survive being hit, only to avoid being hit. The crash in the Solomons forced American pilots and engineers to reckon with a deeper question that spread through the ranks like shock. How had this fragile aircraft caused such devastation at sea? Sinkings at Pearl Harbor, the loss of the mighty battleship Prince of Wales, the death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself. How had something so vulnerable wielded such terror? In the uneasy calm of the clearing, surrounded by steaming jungle and distant artillery fire, U.S. investigators paced around the broken Betty in disbelief. They peeled back panels that were barely thicker than sheet metal. They ran hands across gashes where fuel tanks, unsealed, unshielded, had ruptured with frightening ease. The smell of gasoline clung to the air like a warning. "That's it," one pilot murmured. "That's all that stood between this thing and a fireball?" What they saw contradicted not just expectation, but American technological identity. For the United States, airpower meant engineering depth, bulky, durable, almost agricultural machines built to take punishment. But the Japanese had followed the opposite path. The aircraft was a blade, not a shield. Fragility was the cost of reach. Vulnerability was the price of ambition. And in those early years of the Pacific War, before radar rings tightened, before fighter escorts multiplied, before American industrial might surged forward, that trade-off had worked. The Betty's long range allowed Japan to strike first, to strike unexpectedly, and to strike far beyond what American planners believed possible. Its very existence had redrawn maps. Now, here on a muddy stretch of the Solomons, the myth was cracking open. This moment, intimate, technical, almost forensic, became a turning point in the American understanding of its adversary. Once pilots realized that the Betty was a glass hammer, everything changed. Tactics, intercept angles, confidence. The fear that had once surrounded the bomber began to dissolve into a new calculus of exploitation. Yet behind the rivets and ruptured tanks lay a more human story. Japan had built the G4M for an empire that believed it could outrun its enemies. America had assumed that any machine capable of such devastation must have been built like their own. Both were wrong. This is the story of what happens when two civilizations look at the same machine and see entirely different truths. How a single captured bomber exposed the philosophy behind an empire, revealed the limits of ambition, and became a symbol of the larger struggle raging across the Pacific. For in that wrecked clearing, amid the smell of oil and rain, the U.S. pilots uncovered something deeper than a technical flaw. They discovered a worldview in metal, a belief that war could be won not by enduring the enemy, but by reaching him first. A belief that speed could replace safety. That range could replace armor. That victory could replace survival. In the end, the exposed fuel tanks of the Betty bomber revealed more than a design problem. They revealed the fragile intersection of technology, ideology, and human will. They exposed the peril of a nation betting everything on momentum. And they reminded the world that, in war as in life, the difference between strength and weakness is often a matter of perspective. This is the story of the bomber that was feared because it was flawed, respected because it was reckless, and remembered because it dared to fly farther than anyone thought possible. Before the war turned against Japan, before the tide of steel, fuel, and men flowed eastward from American shores, there was a moment when the Pacific felt immeasurable, when distance itself seemed Japan's ally. In 1941 and early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy was an organism built for reach. Its strategy was painted across oceans, not continents. Leap across the map, strike the undefended, move faster than reaction itself. At the center of that philosophy stood an aircraft conceived in the late 1930s by Mitsubishi engineer Kiro Honjo, the Mitsubishi G4M, designated by the Allies as the Betty. From the beginning, the requirements were audacious, almost reckless. The Navy demanded a bomber that could fly 3,000 kilometers without refueling, carry a single deadly aerial torpedo, and outrun anything the Chinese Air Force or colonial Western garrisons could scramble into the sky. Honjo knew the laws of physics would not be kind. Weight meant drag, drag meant fuel, fuel meant weight again. It was a circle with no end unless something was sacrificed. He sacrificed everything that slowed the machine. No armor plating for the pilots. No self-sealing fuel tanks. Minimal structural reinforcement. Thin aluminum skin that rivaled soda cans in thickness. The Navy accepted all of it. What mattered was range. What mattered was reach. And in 1941, as Japanese forces swept across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, this philosophy did not feel like madness. It felt like prophecy. The Betty proved it on December 10, 1941, when squadrons from the 22nd Air Flotilla located and attacked two British capital ships, the HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, off the coast of Malaya. With no fighter cover overhead, the Royal Navy warships became perfect silhouettes against the sea. Betty bombers, sleek and mirage-like in the humid air, swooped in with Type 91 torpedoes slung beneath. By the time they turned away, both ships were mortally wounded. The world took notice. In that moment, the Betty was not a fragile machine. It was an omen. But even omens bleed. And as the Allies recovered from early losses and began to push back, American pilots, flying sturdier craft like the P-38 Lightning, F-4F Wildcat, and later the F-6F Hellcat, started to realize what Japanese designers had gambled. The Betty could not take sustained fire. A few well-placed shots into its wings or fuselage turned it into a comet of burning fuel. Stories spread of Bettys that erupted in flame after a single hit, detonating midair as though they carried their own crematoriums on board. Still, its long range made it a persistent threat. And it was this contradiction, dangerous yet delicate, that puzzled the American intelligence community. Something about the plane's presence did not match the rumors of its shortcomings. It wasn't until early 1943, when one was captured largely intact, that the United States saw the truth up close. The crash came in the last days of a brutal campaign on Guadalcanal. American forces had begun establishing air superiority when one damaged Betty attempted a desperate withdrawal from a failed nighttime attack. Hit by AA fire and losing oil pressure, it turned southeast, limping through the cloud ceilings as dawn crept in muted orange bands across the horizon. Witnesses saw it circle once, low, unsteady, before clipping a stand of palms and spiraling down into the clearing. Within hours, U.S. investigators were on site, led by a composite team of the 13th Air Force, naval intelligence officers and mechanics familiar with Japanese equipment. They expected the usual: shredded metal, exploded tanks, nothing to salvage. What they found was astonishing. The plane had not exploded. The fuel tanks, so large and so exposed that they bulged from the fuselage like swollen organs, had ruptured, but the crash impact had scattered the gasoline rather than ignited it. Much of the airframe, including the cockpit, nose turret and right wing assembly, remained intact enough for analysis. Major Daniel Harriman, an aircraft engineer attached to the team, recorded in his report. Tank skins appear untreated. No lining, no sealing, no reinforcement. Fuel bladders absent. In essence, the tanks were aluminum boxes. Vulnerability is extreme. A .30 caliber round would suffice to ignite them. To pilots who had faced Bettys in air-to-air combat, this finding was surreal. For months, they had attributed the bomber's resilience to clever Japanese design. believing there must be armor or internal baffling they simply hadn't seen. But as they walked the wreckage, the truth stared back unblinking. The Japanese had designed an aircraft where fuel tanks occupied enormous sections of both wings, directly visible once the thin skin tore away. There was no mystery. It was exposed by design. The intelligence summary from that week put it succinctly. Enemy bomber achieves range through unacceptable risk to crew. Its purpose prioritizes mission over survival. This was more than a technical revelation. It was psychological. American pilots now understood that the Betty was not a juggernaut but a killing machine designed under a different moral arithmetic. The Japanese built around mission execution. Americans built around crew survivability. The contrast was stark, ideological, and deeply cultural. The capture of the Betty began circulating through fighter squadrons like folklore. Pilots who once approached the aircraft with caution now plotted new tactics. Attack from high-angle deflection, target the wing roots. Aim for mid-fuselage fuel reservoirs, where ammunition could spark catastrophic fire. Coordinate pincer attacks to overwhelm its rear-facing 20mm cannon. By late 1943, kill ratios began shifting. What had been a dangerous adversary became a vulnerable target, if engaged correctly. The turning point had come not from a new American weapon, but from a clearer understanding of an old Japanese one. With the truth exposed, the Pacific skies became a crucible in which two nations tested their beliefs. Japanese response. For Japanese planners, the Betty's vulnerabilities were not revelations, they were accepted consequences. Naval doctrine held that surprise, speed, and coordinated assault outweighed the need for armor. The G4M was never meant to fly back through a gauntlet of interceptors. It was meant to strike first and strike decisively. The Japanese crews understood this as well. In interviews after the war, several surviving pilots confessed they felt they were flying with fire in our wings. One navigator wrote, "We all knew what one bullet could do. But our officers told us range was our armor. If we reached the enemy before he reached us, we were protected." This was the creed of the early war Japanese Navy. The offensive spirit, seishin, was superior to defensive engineering. But by mid-1943, this creed was faltering. American response. American airmen reacted to the Betty's fragility with a mix of relief and grim opportunism. Radio chatter captured by unit historians includes, "Go for the wings, hit those tanks. She's burning, pull off. One spark and she's done." But the vulnerability also bred respect. Many U.S. pilots began to see Betty crews not as faceless enemies, but as men trapped in a paradox, warriors flying machines that valued range over life. A diary entry from Lieutenant Frank Tobin, a P-38 pilot, reads, "They kept coming even knowing we'd tear them open with a burst or two. I can't decide if that's bravery or tragedy." War in the Pacific was fought not only in grand strategy rooms but also in moments of unimaginable intimacy, split-second decisions, flaming wreckage, and the faces of men who looked up toward death or victory. American pilots recalled the sight of a Betty catching fire as instantaneous, total, and terrifying. One compared it to watching a lantern filled with gasoline burst in midair. Conversely, Japanese survivors of downed Betty squadrons described the dread of flying missions where even a glancing hit could doom the crew. A radioman's final letter home, recovered from a crash site on Bougainville, said, "The G4M is beautiful, fast, and obedient. But when I touch the fuselage I feel its thinness. Sometimes I think I can hear the fuel sloshing beside me. We are at the mercy of the first bullet." These voices, from both sides, reveal a shared vulnerability that transcended nationality. The Betty's exposed tanks were not merely an engineering flaw. They were an emotional burden on the men who flew them. By 1944, as American industrial power surged, the Betty's design philosophy became increasingly untenable. Numbers told the story starkly. Of the 400-plus Bettys produced, over 1,000 were lost to combat. A significant portion of losses, nearly 70%, were attributed to fire resulting from fuel tank hits. During operations around Rabaul and the Solomons, entire formations of Bettys were destroyed before they could release torpedoes. The psychological impact was profound. American pilots shifted from dread to dominance. Japanese crews shifted from confidence to fatalism. The Betty's vulnerabilities shaped the outcomes of major operations. The death of Admiral Yamamoto in April 1943, when P-38s intercepted and destroyed his escorting Betty transport, was a direct consequence of the aircraft's inability to withstand sustained fire. The defense of Rabaul crumbled as Betty losses skyrocketed, depriving the Japanese Navy of long-range striking power. By late 1944, the Betty was repurposed for desperate missions, including kamikaze operations where survivability no longer mattered. In the end, the aircraft that embodied early Japanese dominance became a symbol of the empire's strategic overreach. When U.S. pilots first surrounded that crashed Betty in the Solomon Islands, they expected to find a secret. Instead, they found a truth. The Japanese had built a bomber that wagered everything on reach, and in doing so revealed the peril of believing that the boldest gamble is always the wisest. The Betty was more than an airplane. It was a philosophy with wings. To the Japanese, it represented the romantic ideal of the offensive spirit. To the Americans, it demonstrated the power of engineering discipline. To the world, it showed how technology reflects the culture that creates it. The exposed fuel tanks were not a mistake. They were a decision, a choice made by designers confident that speed could outrun vulnerability and that courage could compensate for fragility. And for a time, that belief reshaped the Pacific and burned itself into history's memory. In the final accounting of the Pacific War, the skies grew quiet and the oceans, once carved by flame and steel, settled into blue silence. But the questions raised by that single captured Betty bomber did not fade. Instead, they deepened, taking on a meaning far larger than any one battle, any one aircraft, or even any one nation's triumph or defeat. Because what the Americans discovered in that jungle clearing was not merely the anatomy of an enemy machine. They discovered the anatomy of a philosophy. And when wars end, philosophies linger. The shadow left behind. In the years after 1945, both nations sifted through the wreckage of their empires, searching for meaning in the twisted metal. Japan, devastated and demilitarized, confronted the harsh arithmetic of the war. Its machines had been fast, elegant, even daring, but often suicidal in design. The exposed fuel tanks of the G4M became a symbol for something larger, something painful. The belief that sacrifice could replace sustainability, and that willpower could substitute for protection. For surviving Japanese aviators, the Betty became a ghost of memory. Some recalled its speed with pride. Others remembered its fragility with sorrow. A few simply described it the way a soldier might speak of an old wound, quietly, without bitterness, and with a kind of resigned affection. One former Betty pilot wrote in 1961, "She gave us wings long enough to touch the horizon, but not enough strength to return from it." In that line lies the moral irony of the aircraft. The very feature that made it extraordinary, its reach, was also the feature that doomed it. Range came at the cost of survival, and survival came at the cost of range. There was never a compromise, only a choice. The Empire chose range. Its people paid the price. The American takeaway. For the United States, the captured Betty represented a different kind of lesson. It was a study in contrast, an affirmation of a doctrine that valued crew protection, fire suppression, and engineering redundancy. The Americans learned that their fear of the Betty had been based not on its strength, but on its purpose. And once they understood its purpose, its power was diminished. This discovery hardened American doctrine for decades. The U.S. would design aircraft around the principle that a machine must give its crew a fighting chance to survive even the worst day of their lives. Self-sealing tanks became standard. Armor plating became non-negotiable. Redundancy became religion. Yet even as American engineers moved forward, many reflected privately on the courage of the men who had flown the Japanese bomber. Pilots who studied the wreck in 1943 often confessed years later that the Betty had forced them to reconsider the enemy not as an abstraction, but as human beings placed in impossible circumstances. As one American veteran noted, "We feared the plane until we saw how it was built. Then we feared for the men who had to fly it." This shift, from fear to understanding, is one of history's quiet victories. The legacy of a burning sky. Technically, the G4M left behind little to emulate. It was not a template for future bombers. It was not a design genius misunderstood in its own time. But it did leave behind a legacy, subtle, psychological, and enduring. Its destruction in the thousands during the latter half of the war became a cautionary tale in aerospace circles. Speed without protection is a gamble. Range without survivability is a fantasy. Ideology cannot substitute for engineering. After the war, Japan reinvented itself not through weapons but through industry, technology, and manufacturing precision. The nation that once produced an aircraft defined by sacrifice became a world leader in products defined by reliability. That too is part of the Betty's legacy, an inversion of purpose, a quiet rebirth. The human cost of a design philosophy. At the heart of this story lies a truth that no technical diagram or combat report can soften. thousands of Japanese aviators died because their aircraft was designed to reach far, not to return. Their sacrifice was written not in ideology alone, but in the engineering decisions that shaped the wings beneath them. Some historians argue the Betty embodied the fatalism of pre-war Japanese strategy. Others argue it symbolized the nation's ambition. But perhaps the truth is simpler. It reflected a world where leaders believed speed and daring could compensate for a lack of resources, a world where the machine had to perform beyond its limits because the empire itself did. Its exposed tanks were not a flaw of ignorance. They were a marker of desperation, confidence, and calculation combined. The bomber was a blade honed so thin that it cut both ways. The reversal of fortune. By war's end, the irony was complete. The bomber that once terrified Allied navies became a burning target in the sky. The machine designed to strike first became the machine most likely to fall first. And the empire that believed range could buy victory discovered that endurance, industrial, technological, and human, mattered far more. Japan, defeated, rebuilt itself into a peaceful powerhouse. America, victorious, learned the cost of underestimating an adversary's ingenuity, and the value of understanding it. And in the quiet years after the war, when veterans reflected on the machines that had shaped their fates, the Betty remained lodged in memory not as a villain, nor as a marvel, but as a paradox. The line that lingers. If there is one image that endures from this story, one line that captures the tragedy and brilliance of the Betty bomber, it is this: range was our armor. Those 4 words, spoken decades later by a former Japanese crewman, echo with all the weight of a vanished world. They tell of men who trusted their machine not to survive but to arrive. They speak of a nation that gambled everything on momentum and suffered the consequences when momentum ran out. And they remind us that behind every aircraft, behind every design philosophy, there are human beings living with the choices made by others. The Betty's tanks were exposed not because engineers forgot to protect them, but because they believed protection was a luxury they could not afford. That belief shaped lives. It shaped battles. It shaped history. The universal lesson. In the end, the story of the captured Betty bomber, its fragile skin, its exposed fuel tanks, its contradictory power, reveals something timeless about civilization itself. Technology carries the imprint of the values that create it. Nations build machines in their own image, whether that image is cautious or daring, pragmatic or idealistic, defensive or offensive. And when those machines take flight, they carry both the strengths and the flaws of the societies that shape them. The Betty bomber teaches us that ambition without protection can become self-destruction, that boldness without foresight can become tragedy, and that the human beings inside the machine are always the ones who bear the consequences. But it also teaches us something enduring and hopeful. When we understand the designs of our enemies, we often discover their humanity, and, in doing so, rediscover our own. The war is long over. The wrecks have rusted into coral reefs. The skies above the Pacific are peaceful again. But the lesson remains. In the end, it was not speed, nor firepower, nor even range that shaped the course of history. It was the realization, on both sides, that human life is the one element of warfare too precious to expend. And so the story of the Betty bomber closes not with flames in the sky, but with a truth that reaches far beyond the Pacific. In the final measure of civilization, the greatest power is not how far we can strike, but how deeply we learn.